Can everybody hear me in the back okay? All right, good. I recently became an assistant basketball coach for my children's basketball league here. Surprise, surprise. And Saturday's game, 2 games were very robust. So I'm trying to make sure people can hear me in lecture and in presentation. All right, so thank you for that introduction. I'm here to give a talk on just some current research and kind of focusing on it through the perspective and through the lens of what's referred to as Black psychology. So we'll get a little taste of what psychology is for those of you who aren't majors or haven't taken a class or it's been a while, and then we're just going to kind of focus and walk through the talk. And if you have questions, just let me know. There's a specified time at the end, but if you have any in the interim, then hopefully I can clear some up for you as well. Okay? So with that, the salutation, hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and then as we go through, essentially we're just going to kind of follow this agenda that I have here, looking at the brain, looking at the heart, and I'm going to kind of weave in some of the research that I've done in order to try to make some of these connections. Hopefully I do that in a way that is understandable. And then we'll close out. I'll say my goodbyes, I'll have questions, and then we can continue to have, hopefully what you've already been experiencing is a great day. All right, so this is me. It's a relatively recent picture, so it's just easy the resemblance there. Also, I'm very proud of my regalia. I recently did get my PhD, so I'm excited about that. Also, in commencement, if you look out, the bright red robe, that is me. It is very standout. Yes, I did get my bachelor's in psychology at Winston-Salem State University. That's an HBCU, Historical Black College University in North Carolina. That was a really formative time. And I'm going to camp out a little bit here because, just because of my experiences, and hopefully you can see how I'm talking about it from a kind of general perspective. I'm somewhat speaking on behalf of Black people in a way, if you can say, but I'm also incorporating my own experiences and that as a psychologist in general as well. So you can kind of see how all of this comes together to kind of form these different perspectives that we can have, these different angles we can look at our life and existence. So at the HBCU, it was not that much bigger than this school here at Eastern. There was a very unique culture that is present and relatively famous for HBCUs. Close, tight-knit community, similar to here as well. And there was a lot incorporated with that experience of being at an HBCU, from the classes that we would take to the programming that was there for the students to the faculty, and just kind of forming and giving individuals a sense of this is somewhere where you can be kind of who you are. And I think that's important because as we strive to kind of progress and make our way in our lives to kind of improve them, whether it's through this education to hopefully acquire greater income and hopefully to build wealth and be able to enjoy what is the American experience, or at least that's what we're told it is, this is a very formative place. And HBCUs are one of the greatest, if not, I believe they're the greatest producers of Black professionals and Black graduates. So, very important time there. I actually started out as a music major, but then I ended up deciding between business and psychology, and I started to do psychology research, and that's what got me to Ohio State University. Very different place, very different dynamics, lots of different things to challenge me there, not just academically, but socially as well. It was a kind of a reframing, because you go from a campus with 6,000 students to a campus with 60,000 students, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, okay, this is different. And it's outside of my home, because I grew up in rural Eastern North Carolina, in Bertie County, in what is known as the Inner Banks. You may have heard of the Outer Banks, but this is, you got to cross the swamp away from the islands and the beach where everybody wants to go to get where I'm from. Okay? And so once you get there, it's a really different place. I grew up about 5 miles from a historic plantation site. We visited often. And again, my family, my education growing up there, really formative, especially when we would take our trips over to the plantations. And looking back, you kind of wonder what might have been some of the motivations for those. Not saying there was anything nefarious, but you can imagine when a 7 or 8 year old is taken to a plantation and then has the experience of literally picking cotton there, right? So that can be kind of formative for an individual. Anyway, fast forward to Ohio State, began to study. I've worked in cognitive psychology, And then I kind of transitioned, moved around a lot. I moved from area to area, kind of building my own program, if you kind of will. So they didn't have a human performance, human factors area, so I just kind of took a variety of different classes, which ultimately kind of helped once I graduated and came here to Eastern, where I am an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Political Science. And for my colleagues here, so thank you. So the research interests that I have stem primarily in the psychophysiology realm, and that's basically looking at the connection between the heart and the brain. So we're going to dive into that more directly. I also do some things dealing with politics. I mentioned before human factors and ergonomics, so that's kind of how people interface with things. And that ties and is related to this idea of design research, so using elements of design to do research, but then also researching how people design things, which flows into aspects of environmental psychology as well. So environmental psychology is not just promoting us to all be tree huggers, but it's about the natural and the built environment and the impact that the natural and built environment has on our psychology, but then also how we as people, we as humans, view the environment. Some of us may have what's called an anthropocentric view, which is more of a humans are kind of the masters of the domain, so we deal with it this way. Some of us have more of an ecocentric view, which is people are part of nature, people work with nature, partnership kind of a deal, and we should protect it. So all of these things, all of my experiences so far kind of go into these areas of work and areas of research. So now we're going to move on to this first section where I talk about our brain, particularly science, and again I wanted to kind of highlight what psychology is for people. The scientific study of mind and behavior, okay, and this is originating from these speculative disciplines of philosophy and the applied discipline of physiology. So way back when, we were kind of speculating philosophically about things, but then there was also the physiological aspect, and that carries through all the way to the current day. It stems from the word psyche and logos, meaning life and explanation, so exploring life. It's a familiar experience by all people because we are all humans, so we all have this idea of what psychology is. But the interesting thing about it, one of the things that keeps me going in this area, is that we have these unique individual differences and perceptions that everybody has as well. And there's a bit of a difference, and I tell this to the folks who take my psychology classes that I teach. You know, you have your own lived experiences, but it's something different when you start to take a look at it through the lens of psychological science. And so the major goal of psychology is to describe, predict, and explain human behaviors. And this is done through skepticism, which is, questioning things, having an open mind, being available to the information, and not necessarily just adopting whatever someone is telling you right away, but rather you are questioning. You have ideas. You want to know more information about it. And I want to point out that skepticism is not cynicism. Right? Cynicism having this more negative bent towards things, but rather just having an open perspective towards it. We also want to be objective, making sure that although we may have certain ideas about what might transpire, what does the data tell us? And that goes along also with empirical or scientific methodology, making sure that we are having methods that can be reproducible, making sure that we are identifying what's happening in the data, making sure that we are exploring that things can be falsifiable, meaning that we are, again, seeing what the data say, regardless of our what we would like for it to say, which is a thing, and you got to be careful with that. And there's a lot of different fields in psychology. Again, so we have, clinical, social, cognitive, developmental, lots of different places that you can go in this area. And so with Black psychology specifically, this is kind of a sub-discipline of psychology, but it's also a bit of a perspective that you can look at. So, in a nutshell, it's the attempt of Black psychology is to validate the lived experiences of Black people. And there's Black psychology, there's African psychology. In this realm of Black psychology in general, you have these debates that will go back and forth as to whether or not we need to distinguish these things and whether or not that's an appropriate way to approach it. But nevertheless, the idea of having this kind of psychology is to study various influences on the psychology of Black people, whether or not they're the descendants of American child slavery or African American immigrants who come in. Okay? And, in that debate, there is a way in which you might consider is there a general kind of African perspective that is still in place, although people are part of the diaspora, and then, or diaspora, however you properly pronounce that, the diaspora, and whether or not that carries over and has continued in certain kinds of traditions. And then you can also, once you start to disaggregate data, and what I mean by that, when you look at things like the census and it says, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, white, or you look at the census and it'll say like Black or African American, but then it'll say for other categories there will be lots of other things that you can kind of claim, like if you're Asian Pacific Islander, maybe Chinese, Japanese, or all these other categories. When you look at the data, you begin to disaggregate and look at the groups, people who've been here, people who are migrating here, you can see that there's some differences there. So all of this is worth exploring. And whereas African psychology can be traced back to Kemet, modern Black psychology was birthed in response to what some people call psychology's assault on Blacks' sense of self. So if you have a Eurocentric perspective, which was the origins of psychology, American psychology, and other psychology, when you bring in those historical names like Wilhelm Wundt, who started his lab in Germany, and William James, who started his lab over here in America, in those times, who had that access to knowledge, who had that access to university. Okay, and so if those perspectives were the foundation for the lens of psychology, generally speaking, then how might that have affected folks who don't belong to those particular groups? And when you have specific names for slaves that were wanting to escape and find freedom, but those terms were essentially labeling them as crazy or in a frenzy, or having a specific madness because they wanted to leave their condition, it's worth, again, investigating what it is that Eurocentric views of psychology might have when it comes to impact data. So there's an association, or a couple of different organizations really. There's also a Journal of Black Psychology and some others that exist there. And so they, in the Association of Black Psychologists, would say that their goal is to promote social justice, cultural psychology, racial and ethnic identity, and multicultural competencies, and also try to address challenges that might face the Black community. So you can be in this space and work from a specific standpoint within Black psychology. The work that I do is adjacent and kind of related to Black psychology, and so either way, under the umbrella of psychology in general, we want to describe, predict, and explain human behavior, but we also want to try to help improve people's lives. And so in general, we can understand psychology as studying parts of the brain and identifying what's going on there. And as we will see, physiology is really important to psychology. And we can't really, in my opinion, can't really talk about the brain without really getting into physiology, especially when it comes to kind of that interface of how people actually live their lives. And so we have basic research where people just kind of research to know what's going on, and you have applied research where people take what we found out and we put it to use. So you can have influences in other areas of psychology. So, when my students come into class and we're taking intro to psychology and they may or may not know what to expect, but then we start hitting places and get to neuroscience and talking about the brain, body, and behavior, and all of a sudden we're talking about the endocrine system. It's like, is this, biology or is it psychology? It's like, it's both. Hooray, right? And it's important because, one of the things, and I've put a few bits of information here, and you can see in the slide what specific elements of the body do. But one of the things I want to focus on here is the fact that we have these hormones that are produced in certain areas that help regulate growth, stress, sexual functions, and chemical balance in the body. And that's important because once we interface with the world, we have to take into account that the stress that we encounter and the stress that we have to somehow navigate would ultimately have an impact on our body. So one of the areas of focus in my research has been looking at the autonomic nervous system. And it is here we can divide the autonomic nervous system into a couple of different places. The parasympathetic nervous system with the PNS, and the sympathetic nervous system with the SNS. So the parasympathetic, you can kind of think of rest and digest. Sympathetic, you may have heard the fight or flight. All right, gearing you up, getting you ready to go. The interesting thing from my work is that we're relating what happens in the brain to what happens in the physiology because of the way in which the nervous system kind of goes and affects different parts of our body. So with the sympathetic nervous system, it'll serve all of the blood vessels. The specialty is coordinating your visceral organs or your insides during stress or excitation, again, fight or flight. And it will have an impact on your heart rate at a relatively slow impact within 1 to 2 seconds. So you'll see some of those impacts on your heart rate from your sympathetic nervous system at that 1 to 2 second mark. And it significantly influences what is called as your heart rate variability at these lower frequencies. So I'll explain the VLF and the LF in just a moment. The parasympathetic nervous system, so the one that's over here, you can see it does things like constrict your pupil, inhibits your heart rate. It does several other things, stimulates digestive activity, so that's the rest and digest portion. It has ganglia close to the organs that it does actually influence. The brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. One of the main areas that we study is the vagus nerve. Okay? And that will quickly decrease your heart rate within 0.2 to 0.6 seconds. And it significantly influences your heart rate variability at the VLF, LF, and HF. You can see there's a little bit of an overlap there. And that's going to be important. Why are we talking about this in relation to psychology? Again, we're on this path, we're on this road and seeing how the brain and the body interact here. So it is at this point, we'll take kind of a shift. We'll focus now a little bit more on the heart itself and some of the heart rate variability information that I have to understand and process in order to try to make that connection with our brain. And we can do that through this kind of feedback model. So imagine your brain, now imagine your brain and having those slight slices going down vertically. That's kind of what happens when you enter an fMRI machine. Right? You lay down, they roll you into the machine, they turn the big magnet on, and all of a sudden you hear all this ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk happening. And what it's doing is trying to take slices and images of your brain, not physical slices, you'll come out whole. It'll take those images of your brain at different layers. Well, if you lay those flat, let's say you kind of peel those and place them, that's kind of what we're looking at here. So we have the various components of your brain, some cortical components, midbrain, pons, medullary level, and then the primary outputs. Why is this relevant? And what does this mean? Well, if you notice, before you get to the heart, there's arrows that are going down and arrows that are going back up. We're talking about how the nerves go from your central to your periphery and how you get feedback to your brain. It's important that your nerves on the outside of the periphery that have to do with your senses, how you gather information, tell your body how to respond. Right? Because you won't be able to respond to what you might consider to be a crisis if your periphery is not working. Right? So what it is that we see, what it is that we perceive, all of that is important. And so there's a bidirectional configuration, and when it comes down to the heart, we see that there's essentially kind of two outputs. One is the stellate ganglion, and one is that vagus nerve that I mentioned before, that is what we study. And so because of this bidirectional configuration, HRV, or heart rate variability, and the central nervous system and autonomic nervous system integration can kind of give us this central, so the brain and spine, peripheral neurofeedback. So what does this mean? It means that we can take a look and see, based on the output that is given to the heart, and we can kind of get an index of what might be going on with our nervous system and our brain. So what is heart rate variability? We're all kind of familiar with heart rate, right? 60 beats per minute, your heart is beating. You know, we've heard that having a low resting heart rate is good. Athletes have low resting heart rate, and that's great and very valuable. But another piece that's also important when you get into the work of physiology and psychophysiology is understanding that your heart rate is important, but then also the variability in your heart rate is important as well. So having a regular heartbeat is fine, but you also want to have a heart rate variability that is flexible. So we know what this is. We watch those TV shows where the people are on the thing and they've got them connected and you want to save them. You see the heart rate beeping and then flat lines. We know that's a huge dramatic moment in the show, right? We know that this means life for us. So another reason why this is important is to try to make that connection with the brain. Well, these R's here are representative of the R spike. Because if you get into this stuff, you'll see that this whole beat, this complex, is known as the Qrs Complex. And the R's kind of represent those spikes, so they're called R spikes. So what we have here, we can just count these, And this is millivolts, so we have, our system is based on electricity essentially. And as time goes on, we can count these. And once you hit 60, you might get to that normal average heart rate. Right? But between each of these, so between R1 and R2, between R2 and R3, there's timing that happens. And the timing that happens between those heartbeats is also important. If the timing between these beats is relatively static, what the literature and what the data will tell us is that that means that your system may not be as flexible as it needs to be. And if your system is not as flexible as it needs to be, then that can be problematic for you as you go about your life, and then you have to respond to some of the crises or some of the events that come up. Right? Whether you're nervous because you have to give a talk, or if you experience some sort of moment where you need to quickly swerve out of the way in traffic or anything like that, right? You need to be able to respond to things in your environment. However, if you have greater variability, meaning that at rest, the spaces between your heartbeats is longer sometimes, is shorter at some times, based on what it is that you might be experiencing, or just simply at rest, then that might be indicative that your system can be ready to go and ready to stop. And the way it is that in our labs, the labs that I've been involved with, the idea is that your sympathetic nervous system is kind of always going. Your fight or flight is always kicked in. And it's the job of the parasympathetic nervous system to come in, kind of like brakes, and slow that thing down. If you don't have a good parasympathetic system that is kind of flexible and able to do this, then your fight or flight mode will be up all the time. You might be hypervigilant. You'll have a lot of stress hormones that are flowing through your body. Those pictures I showed you a moment ago, there was all the glands that produce those. And then ultimately, you can start to experience things like burnout and start to have other kinds of negative health effects. Okay? So all this stuff over here, this fancy science-looking stuff, make sure glasses up, right? All the nerdy stuff over here, these are things that we can use in order to kind of study the heart rate. Make some comparisons, kind of try to put people in groups if that's appropriate or necessary. And I just highlighted certain kinds of items here because they correlate very highly, and you can use them in either the time domain to see what's going on as a function of time, or you can see what's going on down here when you start to do some spectral analysis and looking at frequencies. And those frequencies, okay, translate pretty much to what I was showing you a moment ago, where I showed you where sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system have an influence on how our heart reacts to things. Remember, I told you, and we highlighted here, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and I mentioned that there was some overlap for this very low frequency, and that's related to the power that's in this graph, and the low frequency, as both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic have impacts there. What we see here is that only the parasympathetic activity is related to those impacts on your heart at that high frequency level. So this is how we can use this high frequency information and say what we think is happening right now is related to the parasympathetic system, because we see that impact, we see that what's happening there is coming from these high frequency numbers that we can pull out. Great. This is cool. Very nerdy, very fun, very sciencey. But what does this mean as we move further and try to use some sort of language to describe what this stuff is talking about? Well, a few things here. Extensive research has been linked to wrestling our heart rate variability with cognitive function, as well as several other areas. We're talking about emotion regulation, executive functioning, mental and physical health. Emotion regulation, how do you respond to things, right? Because with our emotions, they aren't just feelings that we have, per se. Yes, they can be cognitively appraised or figured out. They can be labeled in a cognitive way, but there's also a physiological response when we experience emotions. And that goes back to what we're talking about. Executive functioning, so this lobe in the front of your brain here, that's responsible for you making judgments and decisions and determinations. Mental and physical health, I believe we're familiar with that. So there's connections found with this cognitive function, your selective attention, how well you're able to direct your cognitive resources towards a specific thing. Affective regulation is what we were talking about before, emotions. Reaction time even. Okay, so some of the cognitive tasks we might put people in, they have to respond at a certain time, and they might have to sacrifice some accuracy in order to move faster. But the people who seem to have those better kinds of reaction times seems to have higher amounts of that high frequency heart rate variability. Okay? In addition to that, heart rate variability can be studied in conjunction with adaptive choice paradigms. So if you're put in a situation where you have to make a decision and the context around you is changing, that's another kind of deal, right? You have cognitive load that is coming up and kind of interfering with what's going on, but you still have to make some sort of decision. So we can study that in psychology as well. So all this flexibility really goes to talk about adaptation. But adaptation doesn't come without costs, and one of these primary costs is stress. What we need to acknowledge is that not every stressor is created equal, nor are the effects of every stressor harmful to both physical and psychological well-being. But what we know is that some are. And so when we get into the things like allostatic load theory, there's a dynamic view of stress as a continual effort of the body to achieve some sort of state of stability. So you might have heard of homeostasis before, where you're trying to get to a point of rest where you can, be okay. When your systems kind of reach a point where they're not flooding your body with, hey, you need to move, you need to react, you need to do these things. You can get to a point where you're, coming back down to what might be your everyday level. That's kind of an idea about homeostasis. And what allostatic load theory does is it kind of pushes it further. And it says, although you might be trying to get your body and your mind back to a space, sorry about that, that's my typical pick your kids up time. Let me go ahead and make sure that that's turned off. So what you want to do is, in the allostatic load theory, you want to just kind of take the idea of homeostasis and you want to try to move that a little bit further and say, the context within the context we're in, you might have to make these changes towards stability, could be shifting. And so there, you have to not only adjust to what's happening, but you also may have to adjust to a new context, and therefore find a new, more flexible kind of state of stability. Again, what does this mean for our psychology? What does this mean for this concept of Black psychology? Well, if we look through the lens, we try to get an understanding of what's happening there with Black people, right, and our experiences in the world. We just brought up stress, and here we can see where the heart and the brain can have that nexus point, if you will, once again. So the dysregulation of your HPA axis, which is your hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and your adrenal glands, that whole system that kind of tells your body, that releases these hormones to help you adjust to your situation, can be a key mediator of the association between physiological distress and depression. Persistent increases in those glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, stress hormone, exerts neurotoxic effects on the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. We know the hippocampus is related to memory and things like that. We know the prefrontal cortex is related to judgment, decision-making, emotion regulation, all those kinds of things. So once again, the introduction of stress into our psychology and physiology, ultimately, we can see that it can have these negative effects. I don't think anybody wants any effects that are labeled as neurotoxic around them, right? Yeah. So, what might this mean? Let's kind of bring it all home together. In this portion, what my attempt to do is to try to get us to kind of put this into maybe look at some of the things that we experience from the lens of someone who might be in a Black psychology perspective, where they study Black psychology in that way. So we're going to take what we know from the brain, we're going to take what we know from the heart, what that means for us physiologically. We're going to now try to look at some of the data, some of the statistics about the life that people in this country, specifically Black Americans, kind of experience, and kind of package that all together. And then, after we look at some of these things, and I believe they're relevant because they can definitely be kind of a source of stress, right? We're going to see what it is we might be able to do in using this perspective and this lens of Black psychology to kind of help us maneuver and to not necessarily get so worked up in what we view as might be the conditions that we live in. So, we're going to now walk through several things here. I want to encourage everyone, this is where in my classes I also encourage folks, don't be afraid of these charts and figures. So you see the numbers, you see all kinds of graphs and things, they're very interesting. You just got to know what you're looking at. So one report shows us that non-white youth still face high levels of discrimination. And here we're talking about perceived discrimination that they might have. So Black youth experience the highest incidence of racial and ethnic discrimination in the U.S., followed closely by Native American youth. So they polled or surveyed these individuals and they got them to respond in a variety of different areas. Here we see being perceived feelings because of ethnic background. They feel that they're being discriminated against. Their peers might treat them differently. That they have unfair or negative treatment from teachers. And that they don't feel accepted. We can see how this would be impactful, right? Because if you have a teacher who might treat you unfairly or negatively, and your perspective is that they're treating you this way because of your makeup, your ethnicity, your race, quote unquote, right? Then that can have obvious impacts on you, as well as this social rejection, not being accepted by your peers. So in case it's hard to see it in the back a little bit, the pink is black, then followed from left to right, Native Americans, white, Asian Pacific Islander, Latino, Hispanic is how this was kind of parsed out here. Okay, so we can see those varying differences in how people reported how their feelings, or in this case, children reported their feelings were. And I wanted to point out also, when it comes to this kind of social exchange that's happening here, you know, what we can also find is that when people perceive to be ostracized or kind of put aside from a social perspective, a social standpoint, some of the same areas that activate during a physical pain response activate in that social context as well. So again, you can see brain and physiology and how you respond to that. Because if you perceive pain, if your brain, maybe perceptually you're kind of coping with it as best you can. But if your physiology is kind of reacting to this outside stress this way, then you know, as we talked about, we see how that might affect the rest of our body. Again, these data are essentially kind of taking the temperature a bit, so we can kind of see where we are from a conditional standpoint, because I think that's important, particularly for people who want to apply this more immediately. So recent black high school attainment on par with national average, which is good. So national average in white, black average in this blue hue here, and we can see that we have different age groups, 25 to 39, 40 to 54, all the way up to 70 and over. We can see how that has pretty much closed this particular gap. When it comes to bachelor's degree or more, we can see how those data kind of parsed out here. This is from some 2020 census data from the US government. Black education is also on the rise. You can see the population age 25 and older with a bachelor's degree or higher. You can see how the trajectory has been going there from 1940s up until 2020. Okay. So the black alone total here, 27.8%, and you can see female, black alone, and black alone male here for 24.7%. Well, we hear about mass incarceration a lot. What are those numbers? So this is some Pew Research data numbers. So blacks and Hispanics make up larger shares of prisoners than of U.S. population. What does this mean? Well, let's take a look at this one here first. So the black population, U.S. adult population is 12%. U.S. prison population, they actually make up 33%, which is even more than the U.S. adult population of white folks over here, all right, who are in prison. So we can see how those numbers kind of pan out. Imprisonment rates have declined across racial and ethnic groups, especially among black Americans. So although these numbers are ridiculously disproportionately high, we can see that there's been a decline in that, which is good. So what factors go into that? Maybe there's some issues of social justice that have been impacting that. Maybe there's some issues of things that have come to light in other places. Maybe there's changes in the legal system. Either way, we see this is the trend of the data. And overall, we see that the imprisonment rate has been on the decline since the late 2000s. There could be other things that contribute to this, right? So you want to have those interventions if people are in there for nonviolent offenses and they're trying to reduce those sentences or maybe reduce how it is that they're being charged. If people are in for things that were once illegal but are no longer legal, perhaps we're arresting less of those folks now. Either way, fewer people are incarcerated and perhaps more people getting the help that they need in other areas would be a good thing. I think we could agree on that. Well, black people aren't just black, right? We also have other areas that we are fully people, fully humans. And so that's why I went ahead and drew in this distribution of household wealth by generation, just to see an idea, get an idea and a temperature for the variety of different black folks that exist out there. So we have silent in earlier generations, the baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And what we see is this wealth by generation in trillions of dollars over this, what is this, like a 30-year period. And we can see how, you know, back in the 90s, and then what's going on here in the 2020s. Now, that hurts my feelings a little bit, doesn't it? Okay, a lot of it. Yeah. All right, so we're going to split this up, distribution of household wealth by race. Okay, so we can see now how when we look at overall wealth and look at those distributions, again, how those trends and how things have transpired. And and the reason I'm showing this, and I can tell you where to find this stuff, because I'm a professor, so I can sign into things and find things, but this isn't any special particular data, right? This stuff is out there. Pew is a research organization that exists, you can look them up and find it. This is data from the Federal Reserve, their government site, you can go find that. Right? So this information is out there, we just gotta, if we're interested in it, we just go look it up and look at it, and try to figure out what that means. We can see how it breaks down there also by race, right? So white is this green chunk here. You can see that since the 90s and once you hit the mid-2000s, it kind of dips. We had that housing bubble kind of crash and people started to lose wealth, but then we had, different people in power and different policies that were passed and all that, and then you can see how quickly folks recovered and then continue to kind of accumulate that kind of wealth to the current day. Here's some more data that's interesting, right? Just want to take the temperature of what's going on in Black America. So nearly half of Black households in the U.S. earned $50K or more in 2019. Median income for Black households is $44,000. Roughly a quarter of Black adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. We saw some of that in that previous slide with education. More than a third of Black people live in households headed by married couples. Okay, so non-family households, male householder, female householder, and married couples, 38%. Majority of Black adults identify as Protestant. Religion, spirituality, that's an important part of our psychology as well. Just want to, again, see how people are identifying. 66% Protestant, 21% unaffiliated, and then we have other Christians, non-Christian faith, and Catholic identifying folks there in terms of percent. Well, we talked about some wealth data, we'll come back to some more, but what about home ownership? Because we often hear, owning a home is one way that you can build generational wealth, and this is how you can kind of get into the spaces so that you can then maybe start your own business or whatever it is, maybe take some, use some of the equity in your home. Well, we can see where this kind of breaks down as well. We can see the trajectory since 1940. You can see how things wax and wane. The blue line here is overall home ownership rates. So we're talking home ownership rate percent. So 43, jumping up here to 66 to 66.9, and then beginning to decline overall. So you can see that it's never really hit higher than 46%, 47% for Black folks since the 1940s, which is, I'm not sure if that's when they began collecting this, but at the very least, this is from this nice little span here from 1940 to 2019. And what you might also notice is that since the 2000s, you see that there's been kind of this decline, it's kind of tapered off here between 2015 and 2019. And then as we progress here, when we look at a 25-year gap between Blacks and whites, this home ownership disparity begins to deepen. And you see this downward kind of trajectory that's already been noted on the previous slide, or a previous image. So what about unemployment? Well, we can take a look and we see Black workers are far more likely to be unemployed than white workers at every level of education. The wage gap is wider now than 40 years ago. The intersection of race and gender seems to impose a dual wage penalty on Black women. Okay? So this is a regression-adjusted hourly wage gap, and we can see how that percentage is higher here on how they are faring. This one right here, down here, is Black men, so we can see how this breaks down on gender as well as by race. The middle line here is white women. A little bit more, some more wealth data that's out there. Wealth rises with age for all families, but substantial wealth gaps between white and non-white families persist throughout the life cycle. So if you're under 35, and this is in thousands of dollars, okay? So here we're talking $600, and here we're talking $25,000, and then we see these increases, and then over 55 we have $315,000, $53,000, $111,000, $215,000 for others. And then that obviously might have an impact here once we start talking about inheritances and gifts that might be passed down. You can see how the numbers differ in this case. And then, of course, that will also impact emergency savings that people might have for rainy days or local pandemics. Right. Liabilities by race in 2021, quarter 3. So this was data, the most recent data that was released this past quarter from last year. So we can see the liabilities. Again, this home mortgages kind of, and this is in trillions of dollars, so not crossing that, so home mortgages, consumer credit, and all other kinds of things. We see how those numbers play out, and that kind of reflects the home ownership rates. Yes? I mean?
Previous slide.
Previous slide? This one?
Emergency. That's 96,000
liquid assets, yeah. That's in a percent. How many people have liquid assets that they can access?
percentage.
Yeah, this one is in percentage, as well as this one.
That's 1,500. That's 1,000.
Yeah, 1,500 here, conditional mean active liquid assets. And then here, I think this is coming to the end of some of this kind of economics, social science kind of related data here. We can see the overall wealth, and that was kind of reflected in one of those slides we saw earlier, which showed us the trend, but this gives us the current snapshot as of what happened last quarter. Okay, so we see here we have real estate, private businesses for that wealth component, right? So 12 trillion, we have 310 trillion over here, 25 trillion for Hispanics, and 1.2 trillion for others. Okay. Real estate, again, reflected in the property ownership that's there, pension entitlements. So we can see that, you know, of the larger chunks, most of the wealth that come for our black folks seem to be kind of caught up in these pension entitlements that are there. Right? Which, you know, what does that mean for folks who are trying to get there, right? Trying to get those pensions and things. So again, what do we do, right? Because this isn't just me showing you all the data, some of it good, some of it maybe not so good, or whatever else. This is, kind of, like I mentioned before, I want us to kind of have an actual, closer to reality understanding of where it is that we might live. Because there's a lot of distractions that exist out there. How do we actually better our condition instead of having this like semblance of embetterment or empowerment? So understanding our conditions, I think, is really important. I think it's also important to understand other psychology, understand who you are as an individual, right? Which may entail being black, which might entail being American, or a Christian, or a man, or a woman, or non-binary, or whatever else it is. But either way, understanding who you are, I think, will give you better footing when it is that you have to go out and react and respond to your reality. And then participate in therapy. I think that's important as well. So we're going to jump in here and talk about a few of these things, right? Because as we saw our condition with some of my economic data that I was trying to present and get across, now I think we also have to understand some of the psychology of other folks. So it's complex, it's diffuse, right? It's distal, or kind of far away. Diffuse is present kind of everywhere. There's ethical and political natures involved with our existence. And I think that this contributes to the difficulties that people may have in understanding issues. In psychology, we call why people do things, or the behaviors they exhibit, as we say that it's multiply determined. That means that there's a lot of different ways, or a lot of different things, a lot of different ways that people may have chosen to do things. And there's a lot that goes into why it is that they have done what they've done, i.e. their behaviors. The assessment of whether issues pose certain risks and whether they respond at all, or how they respond at all, also is influenced by this complex web of life that we have. Right? And it's not just a lack of knowledge that people have. Sometimes it's just a lack of willingness to accept what is out there. That's why we have different cognitive biases like belief perceptions. Despite what might be out there, whether it's just an anecdote of an individual's life or data that may exist, if people believe that something is a certain way, they may be so invested in that they just kind of hold on to that belief despite what's present for them. Attritional ambiguity about causes and impacts of social issues increases uncertainty and potential doubt about the impacts on black folks as well. And there it is again, we talking about this multiple determination, right? So if you can't really attribute it to something specifically and directly, concretely, because it's so much of a amalgamation of things, then okay, well what can we really do about it? And that might be where some people kind of end. Can't forget about news media, right? And how we can contribute some of the confusion brought about be a false balance, what's called, both sides of a particular argument. Well, if one is less validated than the other, especially when in the realm of, social science or whatever, do we really need to bring that up and kind of prop it up as an equal position that's worth taking a look at? Maybe, maybe not. There's other kinds of things that can impact, like psychological distance, whether or not people are really so concerned as to what's happening. Personal experiences can have an impact on these phenomena. I know this person who kind of lives this way, or me and my people are good, and we kind of live this way, so what's the problem? Or, within group othering, well, I'm not like those people who seem to be exhibiting prejudice and discrimination. They're like this because of that, and I've kind of created an other group that I can kind of distance myself from psychologically, and that I can kind of de-identify with because I'm not exactly like them. Although there might be more crossover than we might think, because humans have prejudice, right? That's another side of psychology that we got to deal with. Ideological beliefs can influence the threats from things like climate change, which also impacts people who might be living in certain zones, or might be living in certain areas where that impact can affect them. And sometimes, when we want to go assess the risk of problems, people just don't really want to hear or entertain what those solutions might be because they're just averse to that particular solution. So they don't want to engage with it. So when we go to form our Black identity, these kinds of things begin in the realm of with children. We pay attention to things like racial awareness, attitudes, socialization that the children can go through. This can then influence things like our perceptions of discrimination. Think back to that very first slide with the data I showed you, right? How much they are paying attention to that or aware of that. Race-related vigilance, stigma consciousness, colorism, all these kinds of things. This goes to help form and to shape the identity that we have. Representation in education, as you go from K through 12, and then maybe on to secondary kinds of education. Kimberly Crenshaw points out things like intersectionality, and people like Green argue that you can't really neatly separate those different aspects of what make people who they are, that we've already kind of listed out, very neatly. And so we have to kind of understand that lens as well. I won't go into too much detail now for the sake of time when it comes to this multi-dimensional model of racial identity. This is something that Sellers kind of created back in '98, and this is how people maybe perhaps kind of began to identify racially. And again, this is somewhere in Black psychology that we can take a look at, but the overall point being, what can we do? Well, having this kind of concrete understanding of who we are won't hurt. I mentioned before going and seeking therapy if that's at all possible. One of the things that you can make sure to look out for is displaying cultural, that your therapist can display cultural competence, so they can actually understand what's going on. And this will help you maybe develop more of this trust, because cultural mistrust is an issue, because overdiagnoses in psychopathology and persistent issues in physical health care make it challenging for folks to develop and maintain cultural trust. Some clinical implications. So these are some colleagues of mine in 2018, just very briefly. Brownlow and the other folks in that paper suggest implementing this kind of intersectionality approach so that you can make sure that you are demonstrating as a mental health facilitator or counselor or clinician, making sure that you are providing the space for people if they need to identify in a certain kind of way or use certain kinds of language, that opens it up for them. They can get a better understanding of their condition because they don't feel like they can't really talk about those kinds of issues. And another very interesting thing that's still being parsed out, if you will, remember I was talking about heart rate variability and all that flexibility of your system, how that can be a reflection of that and how that's good for you. But one of the interesting things that they find about Black folks and African Americans here is that greater heart rate variability and greater total peripheral resistance, which is related to your blood pressure, in African Americans relative, there's greater in African Americans relative to their European American counterparts. So Black, white, African American, European American, these are more of the general kinds of terms we use to kind of collapse people based on this, the way things are. What's interesting, what they call the cardiovascular conundrum, is that we see greater HRV associated with decreased risk for poor health, but then greater TPR is associated with increased risk for poor health outcomes. So Black people have both of these things that are normally inversely related, but now they're happening and they seem to be positively associated. So we might have greater HRV, which is good, but then we also have greater total peripheral resistance, which is not good, right? So what does that mean? That's why that's a cardiovascular conundrum. So what else can we do in closing? Quickly, I'll just say things like centering ourselves, so grounding. Interestingly, a trial in 2017 found that commonly asserted causes of wealth disparities associated with individual behavior did not account for differences in wealth when they looked at some of that data. That includes things like lack of education, family instability, lack of motivation to work hard, and poor spending habits. I also want to stress, do not internalize the stress. What else can we do? We can read and write. When you look at some of the people who go through treatment programs because they've experienced some sort of physical or medical issue, when they journal, you see that they seem to heal faster, they heal better. It stands to reason that maybe we can implement some of that. So read, educate yourself, find a balance, be current, but figure out when you need to step back, and don't internalize the stress. Design your space for you and protect it. Whether it's a physical space, a mental space, or a virtual space, yes, be connected and have information, but take care of yourself, and don't internalize the stress. Find your community. We see that that helps a lot when it comes to some of these HRV and heart rate variability, the cardiovascular literature and all that. Find people who you can support and whom you can support, because showing support for other people seems to be beneficial as well. Get connected. Realize that you don't have to self-isolate, even though it may feel like you are, and don't internalize the stress. And then move your body. Okay? If we can have some sort of improvement in HRV, we want to see that, because HRV is essentially your armor. It's how when you navigate space, you kind of protect yourself by how it is that you react and respond. Your sword is your mind, so when you have that HRV, you have those systems, the parasympathetic system is working well enough so that you can have that emotion regulation and all of that. Okay? So you can be sharp, and please, not internalize the stress. With that, I will close out and ask if you have any questions. Yes?
So you said that you started as a music major, and then you were choosing between psychology and business. What led you to land on psychology? Like, was there a specific thing, or?
So from like a college student worry perspective, I had a scholarship for 4 years, and the music program is notorious for keeping people for 5. So, and that's because it was like a music performance, and then also a music business kind of a deal, so you had to learn all the music, and then you had to go take business classes. So I was like, that's not gonna happen. So, in an effort to avoid student loans, and then I went to graduate school. Anyway, so what ended up happening was I was going to change my major to business, because I was like, man, why not? Because I was going to do music business in the first place. But then I came back and I took a psychology class, and the instructor for that class was Dr. Bond, who's the chair of the department here. I'm not that old, so I'm not going to say he's old, but nevertheless, he saw me and he said, oh, okay, you're an honor student, you want to do research? And I was like, sure, I'll do research. And then that kind of caught me, and I was like, this is very interesting.
Okay.
And then I thought that I was going to incorporate some of the music stuff with like music therapy, because I was a camp counselor, activity director at a camp for individuals with autism.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, no, you need to do research. I was like, I can be a counselor. And he was like, so.
All right.
So that's what got me on this path.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Sure.
Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. I guess I want to kind of ask a little about what kind of this black psychology means. So psychology is, what did you say, studying a scientific study of mind and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to apply to kind of all human beings, right?
Yes.
And yet somehow, so is black psychology, how do you classify or use black psychology if psychology is kind of meant to study of human beings' minds and motivations, and specifically kind of to draw this out. So you have different blacks who are going to perceive things differently, who are going to have different levels of stress based upon what they perceive, because they may not perceive a whole lot of things the way some other blacks do.
Mhm.
And so how can that be kind of grouped together as kind of a black psychology? And kind of also relate, so then could there be a white psychology? Can there be a Hispanic psychology? Again, these are all kind of categories too, right, that people are creating. Hispanics include Mexicans and, South Americans, et cetera. Right? So I guess I just want to kind of, what exactly is the black psychology as a distinct from the just psychology in general, and then how can you apply it if there's different black people thinking and feeling and emotion, all those different perspectives.
Well, I think what's important to recognize is that you do, within psychology, as I often say, we want to describe, predict, and explain human behavior, but there's obviously within variability and between variability. So, sure, you could have white psychology, but I think the birth of this is kind of pointing to the fact that general psychology essentially is white psychology. So, on that note, again, the birth of black psychology is there to try to identify perhaps a commonality between a certain people group. I have issues with the term race in general. We need to kind of parse out what is an ethnic group and what is not. But we live in a racialized world, we live in a racialized society specifically, and so the disparate impacts on different people groups led to kind of the rise of what it is that you're describing doesn't necessarily fit from a model perspective of what some of these other people say. So even within black psychology, there's room for people to have, on a spectrum, different kinds of opinions or beliefs or any of that. But one of the things, because if you want to consider what ethnic groups are, you kind of have to move beyond psychology to a degree to our fellow social sciences and take a look at things like anthropology and sociology and some of these other areas, because we're talking about cultural kind of a thing, which is a result of that particular group's products. What do those groups have as shared or common? And it often is just past a specific phenotype. So the label of black might be problematic for some, for others it's kind of a direct identifier for what they are. And that's what I was trying to get at here with this slide, and then also trying to pay attention, trying to acknowledge with kind of this distinction between black or African psychology, because I am in the camp that believes that there's a distinction between people who maybe migrate here from other places and people who have been here for 400 plus years through a specific lineage. Does that answer your question? Does that kind of get a little bit more towards it?
Yeah.
So it's a subdiscipline. So it's a subdiscipline from the general overall psychology, and the idea is to kind of apply that lens in what we know about psychology, and to see from the perspective of black people, but then also to study black people specifically, to see how it is that they might differ, or how they might have similarities.
But then it would be different, but different black people have these different perspectives, though.
Sure.
Okay.
But at the same time, if I may add very quickly, there's something specific about black in America, okay, that make it that their psychological reactions and the impact of the blackness in America transcend everything else. So you may talk about poor psychology, the psychology of the poor, psychology of the rich, right? But if you are poor and black, the psychology of black will be different to some aspects to that of the rich, of the non-black poor. Right? If you are poor, black, the psychology will be different to that of the non-black poor. If you are rich black, the psychology will be different of that of a non-black rich. Therefore, regardless of your social ladder, you are impacted by stresses in life, okay, that's specific to you. And that makes you react differently and behave differently and have different outcomes in society that any other social class may not have.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that's
Therefore,
going to vary among black people.
Sure.
It will
Rich
vary.
and poor, rich and rich black people are going to differ. Rich and poor black people are going to differ. And
Yeah, and
so meaning the rich black person could have the same psychological mindset as a rich white person.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. Exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that a rich black person will have a different psychology than a rich white person because regardless
I'm
of
saying
his
they'll have
wealth,
the same one. I'm saying they'll have the same one.
they
could
will
have the
not.
same
They
one.
could have, but they will not have the same one because since birth they have been exposed to different stresses in society that make them react differently. I take the example of Tyler, the writer and Tyler is he owns the largest production company in Atlanta. Perry Tyler.
Okay.
Perry Tyler, right?
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Tyler Perry.
Oh, gotcha.
So he is rich and wealthy, right? But the way he's doing business and reacting living will be different from the same person who is very rich and doing the same thing because his life experience is different. So his psychology is going to be different. Therefore, it's important to understand that particular psychology that's going to be very, very different.
So,
Okay, I see what you're saying. So
Yeah.
it's not, see, I was concerned that somehow the discipline of psychology, right, being what it is with its methods, right, and so forth, is somehow different for black psychology, and you're going to come to different results, so to speak.
from the discipline of psychology, no, that's why I
So,
was
like, that's
describing
why
it as a
you said-
sub-discipline.
When you said psychology is basically white psychology,
No,
That's
to
what you
be
said,
more
so-
precise, I was saying that some people might argue that because of the origins of psychology and the theories that were developed, in particularly the theories that were developed using specific samples of specific populations, then if you aren't tapping into what black people or anybody else is saying, you're getting the perspective of white people. And so therefore, because of some of these differences that exist, be they economic or political or religious or what have you, is that an appropriate thing to do? To base previous research that was done on a specific group, because we're concerned we're concerned with validity, either way,
right?
internal, external validity. So the questions are, can we reproduce this same kind of thing? If we can't, then what does that say? And that's not necessarily the expertise or even the desire for a vast majority of people who study psychology. So by creating this black psychology, it's not to say that we're a new discipline that's completely divorced from general psychology, if you want to call it. But it's to say we're going to take what we know from our empirical methodology and things that we've done before, apply those to black people, but then also maybe have a different kind of lens in order to interpret what those particular results are. That's why I was trying, I left the particular word off of here, and now it escapes me when I want to use it. But there was, as I mentioned before, there's this particular phrase that back then they were trying to label slaves with, that said that because they wanted to escape their present conditions, they were suffering from this madness and frenzy. But if I'm in bondage and I'm experiencing chattel slavery, I would probably want to escape. And I think that would make me more human than the alternative, right?
Right.
So if you're a discipline, and yes, things can shift and things can change, and somebody today may not label that. But if that's the origins, and if those are kind of the antecedents for what psychology is based in today, then it might be worth taking a look, which is why I decided to do this in the 70s, and say, let's create a new branch, and let's kind of apply what it is that we have experienced, and see what kind of comes out.
Okay, yeah,
Because-
that helps to clarify it. Yeah,
Okay.
I appreciate it, yeah.
Because if you read the mainstream psychology, for example, right, by studying mainstream psychology, you may not be able to understand the reason why black people are reacting the way they are. Even though the theory of mainstream psychology predicts behavior, but the behavior of black people is not what the theory would predict. So you have to study their history and who they are to be able to understand why they're behaving the way they are, where the mainstream psychology may not be able to understand that. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? No?
Yeah, I think that furthers the point.
Thank you, Dr. Speller. I think the students, they need to go to class, some of them, so.
Oh.
Yeah,
So,
Oh, yeah.
presentation, and I hope that everyone had lots of fun as I did. Please join me with another round of applause.